the basement archives of the Pennsylvania State Historical Society, among boxes of yellowed documents and forgotten administrative records, genealogist Sarah Chen made a discovery that would unsettle her for months to come. It was October 2023, and she had been methodically tracing family lineages for clients seeking to understand their ancestral roots. The work was meticulous, often tedious, cross-referencing birth certificates with census records, matching death certificates to burial registries, following the paper trails that document human existence from cradle to grave. But St. Agatha's Home for Children presented a different kind of puzzle entirely. The orphanage had operated from 1923 to 1958 in the rural town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, nestled in the rolling hills of Blair County where industrial progress had barely touched the landscape. According to the surviving administrative records, St. Agatha's maintained consistent occupancy throughout its 35 years of operation. The monthly reports, filed dutifully with the state's Department of Public Welfare, documented between 40 and 52 children residing within its walls at any given time. These reports were comprehensive, detailing expenditures for food, clothing, medical care, and educational materials. They painted the picture of a functioning, if modest, charitable institution serving the county's most vulnerable children. The arithmetic was straightforward. Over 3.5 decades accounting for the natural ebb and flow of arrivals and departures, at least 400 children should have passed through St. Agatha's doors, perhaps more. Chen had worked with orphanage records before. They were gold mines for genealogical research, often providing the only documentation of children who might otherwise have vanished from historical record entirely. Yet when Chen began cross-referencing the names from St. Agatha's intake registers with birth certificates, adoption records, and death registries, she found nothing. Not scattered documentation or partial records, nothing at all. It was as if the children listed in the orphanage's meticulous files had never existed beyond those handwritten ledgers. The absence was absolute and inexplicable. Children named in the orphanage records: Mary Catherine Murphy, age 7, admitted January 1934. Thomas Michael Kelly, age 12, admitted March 1941. Elizabeth Rose Hartwell, age 9, admitted September 1949. Left no trace in the broader documentary landscape of their era. No birth certificates in county registries. No school enrollment records in surrounding districts. No adoption papers filed with family courts. No death certificates when the inevitable childhood illnesses claimed young lives, as they so often did in an era before modern medicine. The pattern held across decades and across every conceivable official record. Chen expanded her search beyond Pennsylvania, wondering if perhaps the children had been transferred to institutions in neighboring states. She contacted archives in Ohio, Maryland, West Virginia, and New York. The response was always the same: no records matching the names and approximate birth dates from St. Agatha's files. Even more disturbing was the institutional documentation itself. While St. Agatha's filed regular reports with state authorities, these reports were curiously devoid of the typical administrative details that characterized other orphanages of the era. There were no intake interviews documenting how children came to the institution, no correspondence with family courts or social workers, no medical evaluations or educational assessments. The children simply appeared in the monthly tallies as if they had materialized from nothing. Chen's unease deepened when she drove to Millbrook to examine the orphanage itself. The building still stood, though it had been abandoned since 1958. The local historical society had attempted minimal preservation efforts, but time and weather had taken their toll. St. Agatha's was a substantial 3-story structure built from local limestone, with tall, narrow windows and a slate roof that had partially collapsed over the eastern wing. A stone chapel adjoined the main building, its steeple still intact but leaning slightly, as if the weight of decades had gradually shifted the foundation. What struck Chen most forcefully was the silence. Even in abandonment, institutional buildings often retain some echo of their former purpose. Schools carry the phantom sound of children's voices. Hospitals maintain an antiseptic stillness that speaks of healing and suffering in equal measure. But St. Agatha's felt deliberately muted, as if sound itself had been systematically removed from the structure. The grounds surrounding the orphanage were equally unsettling. A stone wall, nearly 8 feet high, enclosed approximately 10 acres of what had once been maintained lawns and gardens. The wall showed signs of having been higher once. Metal brackets along the top suggested that wire or additional stonework had extended its reach even further. Within this enclosure, Chen found the remnants of what should have been evidence of childhood. A playground area where rusted metal poles emerged from cracked concrete, a garden space where geometric patterns in the earth suggested former cultivation, and a small cemetery with weathered headstones marking graves from the orphanage's early years. But even the cemetery presented anomalies. Only 7 graves bore dates from St. Agatha's operational period, yet the orphanage's own mortality reports documented dozens of deaths over 35 years. The graves that did exist bore only initials and dates, no full names, no ages, no epitaphs or religious inscriptions that might have provided additional details about the children's lives or deaths. Chen photographed everything methodically, but the images seemed to capture only absence. Empty windows that revealed nothing of the interior, doorways that led to shadows too deep for her camera's flash to penetrate. Gardens where the patterns in the earth suggested deliberate cultivation, but of what, and for what purpose, remained unclear. The most unsettling discovery came when Chen attempted to locate former employees or community members who might have memories of St. Agatha's operation. Millbrook was a small town where generational families had remained for decades, where local knowledge typically passed from grandparents to grandchildren in an unbroken chain of communal memory. Yet when Chen inquired about the orphanage, she encountered a pattern of evasion that felt almost choreographed. "That place closed before I was born," said one woman in her 70s, though basic arithmetic suggested she would have been a child when St. Agatha's was still operational. "My family never had dealings with them," claimed a man whose father had served as the town's doctor during the 1940s, though the orphanage's medical expenses would have required regular physician visits. "I don't recall much about it," repeated several elderly residents, using nearly identical phrasing that suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate coordination. It was this collective amnesia, more than the missing records, that convinced Chen she had stumbled upon something that demanded deeper investigation. Communities might forget peripheral details of their past, but they don't collectively forget the existence of an institution that housed 50 children for 35 years. The absence of memory was as deliberate and complete as the absence of documentation. As winter deepened and Chen continued her research, she began to understand that St. Agatha's Home for Children represented something more complex than administrative oversight or bureaucratic failure. The mathematical impossibility of its records, the architectural anomalies of its buildings, and the systematic erasure of its memory from community consciousness suggested an institution that had operated according to principles far removed from the stated mission of child welfare. The children of St. Agatha's had existed. The documentation was too extensive and too consistent to be fabricated, but they had existed in a space deliberately separated from the normal flow of official recognition, as if the orphanage had served as a kind of administrative limbo where children could reside without leaving traces in the broader world. The question that would haunt Chen through the long winter months was not whether this separation had been accidental, but whether it had been the institution's intended purpose from the very beginning. To understand St. Agatha's anomalous existence, it becomes necessary to examine the historical context that enabled its establishment and sustained its operation for more than 3 decades. The orphanage emerged during a period of significant social disruption in rural Pennsylvania, when the aftermath of World War I had created thousands of displaced children, and the infrastructure of social services remained fragmentary and poorly coordinated. Father Matthias Crane arrived in Millbrook in the spring of 1922, bearing credentials from the Diocese of Pittsburgh and a letter of introduction from the Catholic Charities Organization. He was described in local newspaper accounts as a man of impressive bearing, tall with prematurely gray hair and what one observer called eyes that seemed to see beyond the immediate moment. His stated mission was to establish a facility that would serve orphaned and abandoned children from Blair County and surrounding areas, addressing what diocesan reports identified as a critical need for Catholic institutional care in the region. The timing of Crane's arrival coincided with a period of particular openness to charitable initiatives. The influenza pandemic of 1918 had left numerous children without parents or adequate family support. Industrial accidents in the region's coal mines and steel mills continued to create widows and orphans. Local officials, overwhelmed by requests for assistance they were ill-equipped to provide, welcomed the prospect of a well-funded institution that would assume responsibility for the county's most vulnerable children. Crane's approach to establishing St. Agatha's was methodical and comprehensive. He purchased a substantial tract of land on the outskirts of Millbrook, 10 acres that included a large farmhouse and several outbuildings. Rather than renovating the existing structures, however, Crane ordered their complete demolition and began construction of an entirely new complex designed according to specifications that he claimed reflected the latest thinking in institutional child care. The building contracts preserved in the county courthouse reveal the scope of Crane's vision. The main structure would be 3 stories, built from locally quarried limestone that would provide both durability and integration with the surrounding landscape. The design included dormitories for different age groups, common areas for meals and recreation, administrative offices, and a chapel that would serve as the spiritual heart of the institution. Surrounding the complex, Crane commissioned the construction of a substantial stone wall that he described as necessary for maintaining appropriate boundaries between the children and the outside world. What distinguished St. Agatha's construction from other institutional projects of the era was both its scale and its peculiarities. The building plans filed with county authorities for permitting purposes showed a facility designed to house up to 60 children, unusually large for a rural orphanage. More significantly, the architectural detail suggested an institution designed less for integration with the surrounding community than for self-sufficient isolation. The windows throughout the building were placed higher than typical institutional standards, making it difficult to see either into or out of the structure from ground level. The interior layout included numerous small rooms and narrow corridors that would have made supervision challenging rather than simplified. Most unusually, the building's design incorporated a series of basement levels that extended far deeper than necessary for typical storage or mechanical systems. Construction proceeded through 1922 and into the early months of 1923, employing workers brought in from Pittsburgh rather than local laborers. This decision, while unusual, was explained by Crane as necessary to ensure that the construction met the specific technical requirements of institutional design. The imported workforce lived in temporary housing on the construction site and had minimal interaction with Millbrook residents, creating another layer of separation between St. Agatha's and the surrounding community. The funding for this extensive construction project came through channels that remain remarkably opaque even in historical retrospect. Crane claimed support from the Catholic Charities Organization, but diocesan records show only modest contributions to the project. Additional funding was attributed to private benefactors who wished to remain anonymous, a common enough arrangement in charitable endeavors, but one that left no documentary trail for later verification. When St. Agatha's Home for Children officially opened its doors in August 1923, the dedication ceremony was attended by local officials, representatives from the diocese, and what newspaper accounts described as numerous supporters of this worthy endeavor. Yet the specifics of this ceremony, like so many aspects of the orphanage's operation, left curiously few traces in contemporary records. The local newspaper published a brief notice of the opening, but no detailed coverage of the event, no photographs of the ceremony, and no interviews with Father Crane about his vision for the institution. From the beginning, St. Agatha's operated with a degree of autonomy that was unusual for institutional childcare of the era. While other orphanages were subject to regular inspections by state authorities, maintained correspondence with local school systems, and participated in community events, Crane established patterns of operation that minimized external oversight. He filed the required reports with state agencies, but these documents contained only the statistical information mandated by law, numbers of children, basic financial data, and certifications of compliance with health and safety standards. More significantly, St. Agatha's declined to participate in the cooperative arrangements that typically connected institutional childcare to broader social services. The orphanage did not work with local adoption agencies to place children in family homes. It did not coordinate with public schools to provide education for its residents. It did not participate in community health initiatives or religious events that might have brought the children into contact with Millbrook residents. This isolation was maintained through what Crane described as a comprehensive internal program that provided for all of the children's needs within the orphanage grounds. St. Agatha's employed its own teachers, maintained its own medical facility, operated its own farm to provide food, and even included workshops where older children learned trades that would prepare them for self-sufficient adult lives. On paper, this self-contained approach appeared both progressive and practical, a total environment designed to nurture children from dependency to independence without the disruptions and inconsistencies that often plagued institutional care. Yet the practical implications of this approach created a form of institutional invisibility that would prove deeply troubling in retrospect. The children of St. Agatha's had no contact with the outside world beyond the stone walls that surrounded their daily lives. They attended no public schools where teachers might have observed their development or well-being. They participated in no community activities where neighbors might have formed impressions of their character or circumstances. They received medical care from practitioners employed directly by the institution, leaving no records in the files of local physicians. The financial records that survive from St. Agatha's early years show a steady flow of income from state agencies, reflecting the per-child payments that constituted the primary funding mechanism for institutional child care. These payments continued without interruption throughout the orphanage's operational period, suggesting that state authorities found nothing irregular in the institution's documentation or operation. Yet the absence of corresponding records in other state agencies, no school enrollment data, no medical reports, no adoption proceedings, indicates that St. Agatha's was receiving funding for children who existed only within its own administrative universe. Perhaps most troubling, the record suggests that this administrative invisibility was not an unintended consequence of institutional autonomy, but rather its deliberate goal. Father Crane's correspondence with diocesan authorities, preserved in church archives, reveals a man who viewed external oversight not as helpful accountability, but as unwelcome interference with what he termed the sacred work of formation. He wrote of the need to protect the children from corrupting influences and worldly distractions that might impede their spiritual and moral development. This language of protection and formation would become increasingly significant as investigators attempted to understand what had actually occurred within St. Agatha's walls. The institution had been designed from its inception to operate as a closed system, accountable only to its own internal logic and Father Crane's vision of appropriate child care. The children who entered this system were systematically severed from all external connections and documentation, making them invisible to the very agencies and communities that might have monitored their welfare. As St. Agatha's established its patterns of operation through the 1920s and into the 1930s, it became something unprecedented in the landscape of institutional childcare, a facility that could house children indefinitely without creating any trace of their existence in the broader world. Whether this invisibility served protective purposes, as Crane claimed, or more sinister ones would only become apparent through careful examination of the institution's internal records and the physical evidence that remained within its walls. The discovery that would transform understanding of St. Agatha's came not through official archives or institutional records, but through the patient work of restoration experts attempting to preserve what remained of the orphanage structure. In the spring of 2024, the Millbrook Historical Preservation Society received a modest grant to stabilize the building's foundation and prevent further deterioration of what they viewed as a significant example of early 20th century institutional architecture. The work was routine, shoring up weakened walls, replacing damaged mortar, and addressing the water damage that had plagued the basement levels for decades. It was during this restoration process that contractor Michael Reese discovered an anomaly in the chapel's interior wall. The limestone blocks along the eastern wall showed subtle variations in mortar composition that suggested different periods of construction. When Reese removed several loose stones to assess the structural integrity behind them, he found a cavity that had been deliberately created and sealed. Within this hidden space, wrapped in oiled cloth and remarkably well preserved despite the building's overall deterioration, lay a leather-bound ledger that would prove to be Father Matthias Crane's personal record of St. Agatha's daily operations. Unlike the official reports filed with state agencies, This ledger contained detailed, handwritten entries that spanned the orphanage's entire operational period from 1923 to 1958. The discovery was immediately recognized as historically significant, but the ledger's contents would prove far more disturbing than anyone anticipated. The ledger's early entries, dating from St. Agatha's opening months, initially appeared to document routine institutional administration. Crane recorded arrivals and departures, noted medical concerns, and tracked the daily rhythms of orphanage life with the methodical attention to detail that characterized his public reports. However, even these early entries contained peculiarities that distinguished them from typical institutional records. Rather than using the children's full names, Crane referred to them by numerical designations: Subject 23, Child 41, Number 17, a practice that he never explained, but maintained with absolute consistency throughout the ledger. When he did reference children by name in these early entries, the names frequently failed to match those appearing in the official reports filed with state authorities. This discrepancy suggested that St. Agatha's was maintaining two entirely separate systems of record-keeping, one for external consumption and another for internal purposes. More troubling were the frequent references to what Crane termed arrivals that occurred outside normal administrative hours. These entries typically appeared without explanation: 3 new subjects delivered during night hours, or additional material received as arranged, and were never accompanied by the intake documentation that would have been standard for legitimate orphanage admissions. The timing of these arrivals, almost exclusively during late evening or early morning hours, suggested a deliberate effort to avoid observation by community members or visiting officials. The ledger's middle period, spanning roughly from 1930 to 1945, revealed an evolution in both Crane's record-keeping practices and his apparent understanding of the institution's purpose. The entries became increasingly detailed in their descriptions of individual children, but these descriptions focused on characteristics that seemed unrelated to typical child welfare concerns. Crane noted physical attributes with clinical precision: height, weight, eye color, distinguishing marks, but also recorded more subjective evaluations that suggested he was assessing the children according to criteria that remained opaque. Number 34 shows excellent responsiveness to conditioning protocols. Read one entry from 1934. Physical development proceeding according to specifications. Psychological assessment indicates suitability for advanced preparation. Another entry dated 1937 noted, Child 52 demonstrates concerning attachment patterns, may require additional isolation before ready for final stages. These references to conditioning, preparation, and final stages appeared throughout the ledger's middle period, always without sufficient context to understand their meaning. However, the pattern of language suggested that the children of St. Agatha's were being subjected to some form of systematic process that extended far beyond the educational and religious instruction that would have been expected in a Catholic orphanage. Even more disturbing were the entries that documented what Crane termed selections. These events occurred with irregular frequency, sometimes monthly, sometimes with gaps of several years, but always followed similar patterns. Crane would note that certain children had been selected for advancement or had achieved readiness for transition. These selections were invariably followed by entries indicating that the chosen children had been transferred to the next stage of their development or had graduated to their final placement. What made these selection entries particularly unsettling was their correlation with the orphanage's official mortality records. When cross-referenced with the death certificates filed with county authorities, many of the children described as selected or graduated appeared to have died of various ailments: pneumonia, influenza, heart failure, within days or weeks of their supposed advancement. Yet Crane's private ledger never referred to these events as deaths, maintaining instead the language of progression and fulfillment that characterized his entire record-keeping system. The ledger's final period, from approximately 1945 to the orphanage's closure in 1958, revealed a man whose understanding of his mission had evolved into something approaching religious ecstasy. Crane's entries became longer and more philosophical, filled with references to the sacred arrangement and the profound purpose that guides our work. He wrote extensively about the children's role in what he termed the greater pattern, describing their suffering and sacrifice as necessary components of a cosmic design that transcended ordinary human understanding. The boundary between this world and the next grows thin within these walls, Crane wrote in 1952. The children serve as vessels for a transaction that few could comprehend. Their innocence becomes the currency through which ancient debts are settled and ancient promises fulfilled. Those who question this work fail to understand that some forms of mercy require what appears to be cruelty, and some forms of salvation demand what seems to be sacrifice. These philosophical passages were interspersed with increasingly detailed accounts of nocturnal activities that took place within the orphanage grounds. Crane described ceremonies conducted in the underground chambers, rituals that involved the children in capacities that remained deliberately vague but clearly traumatic. He wrote of preparations that required months of conditioning, culminations that marked the end of individual children's journeys, and offerings that satisfied what he termed the hunger of those who wait beyond the threshold. The ledger's handwriting analysis, conducted by forensic experts, confirmed that all entries were indeed written by Father Crane throughout the specified time periods. The consistency of ink composition and paper quality indicated that the ledger had been maintained contemporaneously with the events it described, rather than fabricated at a later date. This authentication made the ledger's contents impossible to dismiss as fantasy or fabrication, lending documentary weight to descriptions that defied rational explanation. Perhaps most significantly, the ledger's final entries revealed Crane's awareness that St. Agatha's operations would eventually face scrutiny. Beginning in 1955, his entries included frequent references to the approaching conclusion and the necessity of concealment. He wrote detailed instructions for the destruction of evidence, the sealing of underground chambers, and the preparation of alternative explanations for any irregularities that might be discovered after the orphanage's closure. The work must continue in other forms and other places, Crane wrote in one of his last entries, dated just 3 days before St. Agatha's official closure. But this phase of the arrangement has served its purpose. The vessels have been prepared, the offerings have been made, and the compact has been honored. Those who come after will find only shadows and silence, as is proper for work that was never meant to be observed by ordinary eyes. The ledger concluded with a list of names and locations that appeared to represent a network of similar institutions operating under various guises throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. This network, if it indeed existed as Crane described, suggested that St. Agatha's was not an isolated aberration, but rather one component of a larger system designed to produce children who could exist outside normal administrative oversight and community awareness. The Preservation Society turned the ledger over to law enforcement authorities, but the passage of time had rendered most of its revelations beyond the reach of criminal prosecution. However, the document's existence provided the first concrete evidence that St. Agatha's had operated according to principles that bore no resemblance to legitimate child welfare, and that the children who had vanished from official records had indeed existed, not as beneficiaries of institutional care, but as participants in something far more sinister than anyone had previously imagined. The Ledger of Whispers had given voice to the silence that surrounded St. Agatha's for more than 6 decades, but the truths it revealed raised more questions than it answered about the nature of the institution's true purpose and the fate of the children who had lived and died within its walls. The physical structure of St. Agatha's Home for Children had always presented certain anomalies to casual observers, but it was only after the discovery of Father Crane's ledger that these architectural peculiarities began to reveal their deliberate and sinister purpose. What had previously appeared as merely unusual design choices now emerged as components of a carefully engineered system designed to facilitate concealment and control. The modern investigation of St. Agatha's physical structure began in earnest during the summer of 2024. When the Historical Preservation Society's restoration work was temporarily suspended, pending a more comprehensive analysis of the building. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, thermal imaging, and structural analysis revealed that the orphanage's architecture contained layers of deception that had remained hidden for more than 60 years. The main building's most immediately striking feature, windows placed unusually high on exterior walls, had initially been attributed to practical considerations related to heating efficiency and security. However, detailed measurements revealed that the windows were positioned precisely to prevent children of typical orphanage ages from seeing out at ground level. More significantly, the window placement made it nearly impossible for external observers to see into the building's interior spaces, creating a form of architectural invisibility that complemented the institutional invisibility documented in the records. Interior examination revealed even more disturbing design elements. The dormitories, which should have been designed for efficient supervision of multiple children, instead contained numerous small alcoves and partitioned spaces that would have made comprehensive oversight nearly impossible. The layout seemed deliberately designed to create hidden spaces where activities could occur without observation from other areas of the building. The basement levels, originally assumed to contain standard mechanical systems and storage areas, proved to extend far deeper and more extensively than the building's exterior dimensions would suggest. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a complex network of underground chambers that had never appeared on any official architectural plans. These chambers were arranged in a pattern that suggested ritual or ceremonial purposes rather than practical institutional needs. Access to these underground areas was gained through a series of concealed passages that connected to the main building's interior walls. The passages were narrow and steep, designed for adult rather than child access, and led to a central chamber approximately 30 feet below ground level. This chamber, when finally excavated by investigators, revealed constructions and details that bore no resemblance to the rest of the building's architecture. The underground chamber was circular, approximately 20 feet in diameter, with walls constructed from stone blocks that appeared significantly older than the orphanage itself. The craftsmanship suggested construction techniques that predated the building's 1920s origins by several decades, possibly even centuries. Most disturbing were the numerous metal fixtures embedded in the walls at various heights. Fixtures that forensic analysis suggested had been designed to restrain individuals of different sizes and ages. The chamber's floor contained a series of drainage channels that led to a central depression approximately 3 feet in diameter. Chemical analysis of residue found in the drainage system revealed traces of human blood in quantities that suggested regular and extensive use over many years. The age of the residue, determined through carbon dating techniques, confirmed that the chamber had been actively used throughout St. Agatha's operational period. Surrounding the central chamber, investigators discovered a series of smaller rooms that appeared to have served different functions in what could only be described as a systematic process of preparation and conditioning. One room contained the remnants of medical equipment that was far more sophisticated than would have been necessary for basic orphanage healthcare. Another room showed evidence of having been used for extended isolation, with minimal ventilation and no source of natural light. Perhaps most disturbing was a room that appeared to have been designed for the systematic documentation of whatever activities occurred in the underground complex. This room contained built-in shelving that had once held what must have been extensive photographic and written records. While the materials themselves had been removed, forensic analysis of dust patterns and residual adhesive suggested that the documentation had been comprehensive and meticulously organized. The removal of this documentation appeared to have occurred during the final weeks of the orphanage's operation in 1958, consistent with Father Crane's ledger entries about the necessity of concealing evidence before the institution's closure. Investigators found traces of ash in the orphanage's furnace that suggested extensive burning of materials during this period, including what appeared to be photographic film and paper documents. Above ground, the architectural analysis revealed additional features that took on sinister significance in light of the underground discoveries. The orphanage's chapel, which had been built directly above the underground chamber complex, contained acoustic properties that would have effectively masked sounds from below. The thick stone construction and specialized interior design meant that whatever occurred in the basement levels would have been completely inaudible to anyone in the main building or surrounding grounds. The stone wall that surrounded the orphanage grounds also revealed features that suggested purposes beyond simple boundary marking. The wall's interior surface showed evidence of having once supported additional structures, most likely guard towers or observation posts that would have made escape from the grounds nearly impossible. The wall's height and construction also made it extremely difficult to see into the orphanage grounds from outside. maintaining the visual isolation that complemented the administrative invisibility. Investigation of the orphanage's grounds revealed additional disturbing evidence. Ground-penetrating radar identified numerous unmarked burial sites scattered throughout the enclosed area. These graves showed no surface markers and appeared to have been deliberately concealed under what had once been lawn and garden areas. Preliminary excavation of several sites revealed human remains, primarily of children, in various states of preservation. The burial sites contained evidence that suggested the individuals had died under traumatic circumstances. Forensic analysis revealed signs of malnutrition, physical trauma, and in several cases injuries that appeared to be deliberate rather than accidental. The positioning of remains in several graves suggested that burial had occurred immediately after death, without the preparation that would have been standard for legitimate orphanage mortality. Most significantly, the number of burial sites far exceeded the official mortality records that St. Agatha's had filed with county authorities. While official records documented fewer than 20 deaths over 35 years of operation, ground-penetrating radar identified more than 60 potential grave sites within the orphanage grounds. This discrepancy suggested that the vast majority of deaths at St. Agatha's had never been officially recorded or reported to appropriate authorities. The architectural evidence painted a picture of an institution that had been designed from its inception to facilitate activities that required complete concealment from outside observation. Every aspect of the building's design, from window placement to wall construction to underground chambers, served the purpose of creating spaces where children could be held, conditioned, and ultimately sacrificed without leaving traces that would attract official attention or community concern. The orphanage's self-sufficient design, which Father Crane had presented as progressive institutional planning, now appeared as a necessary component of systematic concealment. The internal medical facilities meant that children's injuries would never be observed by outside physicians. The internal educational system meant that children's condition would never be monitored by public school officials. The internal food production meant that the orphanage's supply needs would not reveal the true number of residents to local merchants. Most chilling was the realization that St. Agatha's architecture had been designed not merely to conceal individual incidents of abuse or neglect, but to facilitate an ongoing systematic process that treated children as raw material for purposes that remained incompletely understood. The underground chambers, the burial sites, and the systematic documentation all pointed to an institution that had operated as a kind of production facility, processing children according to specifications that served purposes far removed from any recognizable form of child welfare. The architecture of concealment had functioned perfectly for 35 years, allowing St. Agatha's to operate in plain sight while remaining functionally invisible to the community and authorities that should have protected the children within its walls. Only the passage of time and the patient work of modern investigators had finally revealed the true purpose of the structures that had masqueraded as a charitable institution while serving as something far more sinister. The systematic concealment that enabled St. Agatha's operation for 35 years could not have been maintained through architectural design and administrative invisibility alone. The institution's continued existence required the active participation, willful ignorance, or deliberate complicity of numerous individuals and agencies whose responsibility should have been the protection of vulnerable children. As investigators pieced together the network of relationships that sustained the orphanage, they uncovered a web of institutional and personal failures that extended far beyond the walls of St. Agatha's itself. The most direct form of complicity came from the state agencies responsible for overseeing institutional child care. The Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare received regular reports from St. Agatha's throughout its operational period, and these reports consistently documented compliance with state regulations regarding child welfare, health standards, and educational requirements. However, examination of the department's internal files revealed that no inspector had ever conducted an unannounced visit to the orphanage, and the scheduled inspections that did occur followed patterns that would have allowed ample preparation for concealment of irregularities. The inspection reports themselves, when compared to similar documents from other institutions of the era, showed a remarkable lack of specific detail about the children's conditions, educational progress, or social development. Instead, they focused primarily on structural compliance issues, building maintenance, fire safety, and basic sanitation standards, The reports contained no interviews with individual children, no assessment of educational outcomes, and no evaluation of the psychological well-being of residents. More significantly, the state's financial records showed that St. Agatha's received per-child funding at rates higher than comparable institutions, yet the basis for these enhanced payments was never clearly documented. Correspondence between Father Crane and state officials suggested that the elevated funding was justified by the orphanage's specialized services and comprehensive internal programs, but these services were never specifically defined or independently verified. The Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh, which had initially sponsored Father Crane's establishment of St. Agatha's, maintained what could only be described as a studied distance from the institution's daily operations. While Crane filed regular reports with diocesan authorities, these reports focused exclusively on financial matters and general statistical information. There was no evidence of pastoral visits, no assessment of the religious education being provided to the children, and no evaluation of whether the institution was fulfilling the spiritual mission that justified its Catholic sponsorship. Internal diocesan correspondence, obtained through litigation following the ledger's discovery, revealed that church officials had received periodic inquiries about St. Agatha's operations from other Catholic institutions and community members. However, these inquiries were consistently deflected with form responses that praised Crane's innovative approaches and dedication to comprehensive child development, without providing any specific information about the orphanage's practices or outcomes. Perhaps most troubling was evidence that some diocesan officials were aware of irregularities in St. Agatha's operations, but chose to interpret these irregularities as evidence of the institution's special effectiveness rather than reasons for concern. A 1945 memorandum from the diocesan secretary noted that St. Agatha's had achieved remarkable success in managing children who might otherwise have proven difficult to place, and praised the institution's ability to transform even the most challenging cases into compliant and well-adjusted individuals. The local medical establishment also played a crucial role in maintaining the institutional invisibility that protected St. Agatha's operations. While the orphanage employed its own medical staff, serious cases would occasionally require treatment at the regional hospital in nearby Altoona. Hospital records from the era show numerous admissions of children from St. Agatha's, but these admissions were invariably documented with minimal detail about the circumstances that had required medical intervention. Dr. Robert McMahon, who served as the hospital's chief of pediatrics from 1935 to 1960, left personal papers that were donated to the hospital's archives following his death. These papers included notes about his interactions with St. Agatha's that suggested significant concern about the condition of children brought to the hospital for treatment. McMahon documented cases of severe malnutrition, unexplained injuries, and psychological trauma that he clearly found disturbing. However, McMahon's concerns never translated into official reports to appropriate authorities. His notes suggested that he had been assured by Father Crane that the children's conditions resulted from the severe deprivation they had experienced before arriving at the orphanage, and that their treatment at St. Agatha's represented significant improvement over their previous circumstances. McMahon appeared to have accepted these explanations despite their inconsistency with the children's documented length of residence at the institution. The hospital's administration also showed a pattern of accommodation that facilitated St. Agatha's operations. Children from the orphanage were typically treated in private rooms that minimized their contact with other patients or visitors. Medical records were maintained separately from general hospital files, and discharge summaries were provided directly to Father Crane, rather than being copied to state health authorities, as was standard practice for institutional children. Most significantly, the hospital's mortality record showed that several children from St. Agatha's had died while under medical care, but these deaths were attributed to conditions that seemed inconsistent with the children's documented medical histories. Death certificates listed causes such as pneumonia or heart failure for children who had been admitted with symptoms that suggested very different underlying conditions. The attending physician's notes, when they existed at all, provided minimal detail about the circumstances leading to these deaths. The local law enforcement establishment maintained an equally problematic relationship with St. Agatha's. Blair County Sheriff's Department records from the orphanage's operational period show remarkably few incident reports involving the institution, despite its housing of up to 50 children for 35 years. The absence of reports was particularly striking given that other area institutions, schools, youth organizations, and even other orphanages generated regular documentation of minor incidents, behavioral problems, and occasional more serious concerns. Sheriff William Patterson, who served Blair County from 1940 to 1964, left interview transcripts that were recorded by a local historian in the 1970s. In these interviews, Patterson acknowledged that his department had received occasional inquiries about St. Agatha's operations, but described these inquiries as malicious gossip from community members who didn't understand the difficult work being done there. Patterson stated that he had personally visited the orphanage on several occasions and had found Father Crane to be a man of unquestionable integrity doing God's work under challenging circumstances. However, Patterson's official reports of these visits, when they existed at all, contained only the most general observations about the orphanage's compliance with basic safety standards. There was no documentation of conversations with children, no assessment of their welfare, and no investigation of the specific concerns that had prompted the visits. The report suggested that Patterson's inspections had been superficial and had been conducted with advance notice that would have allowed preparation for concealment of irregularities. The local business community also contributed to the systematic enabling of St. Agatha's operations through patterns of accommodation that prioritized financial relationships over child welfare concerns. The orphanage was a significant customer for local suppliers, purchasing food, clothing, medical supplies, and building materials in quantities that reflected its stated capacity of 40 to 50 children. However, several suppliers later acknowledged that their delivery patterns suggested the orphanage's actual population might have been significantly higher than officially reported. Thomas McKenna, whose family operated a wholesale food business that supplied St. Agatha's throughout its operational period, provided testimony to investigators in 2024 that revealed his long-standing concerns about the orphanage's operations. McKenna stated that his deliveries to St. Agatha's consistently exceeded what would have been necessary for the reported number of children, and that he had observed evidence of underground storage facilities that seemed disproportionate to the institution's stated needs. More troubling was McKenna's account of his interactions with Father Crane during these deliveries. McKenna described Crane as always very controlling about where deliveries were made and when they occurred, noting that he was never allowed to bring supplies to the main building but was required to leave them at a separate storage facility near the orphanage's gate. McKenna also noted that his invoices were always paid promptly and in cash, which was unusual for institutional customers of the era who typically used credit arrangements or check payments. Despite these concerns, McKenna acknowledged that he had never reported his observations to appropriate authorities. He explained his silence by noting that St. Agatha's was an important customer and that Father Crane was well respected in the community. This prioritization of economic relationships over child welfare concerns was echoed by other suppliers who had maintained business relationships with the orphanage despite their private concerns about its operations. The educational establishment's complicity took the form of systematic non-engagement with St. Agatha's children. While state law required educational services for all institutionalized children, St. Agatha's received approval to provide internal education rather than sending children to local public schools. This arrangement was justified by the orphanage's claims about providing specialized educational programs tailored to the children's particular needs. However, examination of local school district records revealed that no official from any area school had ever visited St. Agatha's to evaluate its educational programs or assess the academic progress of its students. The children received no standardized testing, participated in no inter-school activities, and had no contact with the broader educational community that might have provided external oversight of their intellectual and social development. Mary Elizabeth Hartley, who served as superintendent of the Millbrook School District from 1945 to 1963, left personal papers that included correspondence with Father Crane about educational matters. These letters revealed that Hartley had periodically requested meetings to discuss coordination between St. Agatha's internal education programs and district standards, but that these requests had been consistently deflected with assurances that the orphanage's programs exceeded state requirements. Hartley's papers also included draft letters, never sent, expressing concern about the complete absence of St. Agatha's children from any community educational activities. One unsent letter, dated 1952, questioned how an institution could claim to be preparing children for adult life while maintaining complete separation from the social and educational experiences that would be necessary for successful community integration. The community's religious establishment beyond the Catholic hierarchy also demonstrated patterns of complicity through deliberate non-engagement. While Millbrook contained several Protestant churches whose congregations might have been expected to show interest in local child welfare issues, none of these institutions ever initiated contact with St. Agatha's or expressed concern about the orphanage's operations. Reverend James Morrison, who served the Millbrook Presbyterian Church from 1930 to 1965, left sermon notes that occasionally referenced the importance of community responsibility for vulnerable children. However, Morrison's papers contain no evidence that he had ever attempted to visit St. Agatha's or establish relationships with its residents, despite the Presbyterian tradition of community engagement and social service. The pattern of systematic non-engagement extended to women's organizations, charitable societies, and other community groups that typically took active interest in child welfare issues. Organizations that regularly visited other area institutions and provided volunteer services to local families maintained no relationship with St. Agatha's and appeared to accept without question the institution's claims about providing comprehensively for all of its residents' needs. This widespread complicity created what sociologists would later recognize as a classic case of institutional enabling, a situation where numerous individuals and organizations, each making seemingly reasonable individual decisions, collectively created conditions that allowed systematic abuse to continue undetected. The complicity was maintained not through active malice, but through the more subtle mechanisms of willful ignorance, bureaucratic convenience, and the human tendency to defer responsibility to other authorities. The circle of complicity that surrounded St. Agatha's demonstrated how institutional evil can flourish not through the active participation of numerous conspirators, but through the passive enabling of individuals and organizations who choose not to see, not to question, and not to act on concerns that might disrupt comfortable assumptions about institutional legitimacy. The children of St. Agatha's were failed not only by Father Crane and his direct collaborators, but by an entire community structure that prioritized institutional convenience over child welfare and administrative efficiency over moral responsibility. The investigation of St. Agatha's reached its most disturbing phase during the winter of 2024, when structural engineers working on the chapel renovation discovered a second hidden chamber that had remained concealed even from the initial architectural surveys. This chamber, located behind the chapel's altar and accessible only through a passage concealed within the building's thick stone walls, contained Father Matthias Crane's most personal and revealing documents, papers that would finally expose the true nature of the institution he had operated for 35 years. The chamber itself was small, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with walls lined in cedar that had preserved its contents despite the building's general deterioration. Unlike the utilitarian basement chambers that had been designed for the systematic processing of children, this space felt deliberately contemplative, a private sanctuary where Crane had retreated to document his most intimate thoughts about the work he believed himself to be conducting. The papers found within this chamber spanned Crane's entire tenure at St. Agatha's, but unlike his operational ledger, these documents revealed the philosophical and theological framework that had guided his actions. Written in Crane's careful script on high-quality paper that suggested these documents were intended for preservation, the papers took the form of extended meditations on what Crane termed the sacred mathematics of sacrifice and the ancient compact that governs the boundary between worlds. The earliest documents, dating from 1923, revealed that Crane's establishment of St. Agatha's had been motivated by beliefs that bore little resemblance to conventional Catholic theology. Crane wrote extensively about his study of what he called pre-Christian traditions that recognized the necessity of offering innocent life to maintain cosmic balance. He described his work at the orphanage not as child welfare, but as the continuation of practices that weak modern minds have forgotten but which remain necessary for the preservation of order between the seen and unseen realms. The Church in its current form has lost sight of fundamental truths, Crane wrote in a 1925 entry. It speaks of salvation through grace, while ignoring the mathematical requirements that govern spiritual transaction. Innocence must be offered to purchase safety for the guilty. Purity must be consumed to preserve the impure. These are not moral choices but cosmic necessities, as inevitable as the need for seed to die before grain can grow. These theological justifications became increasingly elaborate and specific as Crane's documentation progressed through the 1930s. He wrote detailed treatises on what he termed the economy of innocence, describing children not as individuals deserving care and protection, but as vessels of unstained potential, whose suffering could be transformed into spiritual currency through proper ritual application. The documents revealed that Crane viewed himself not as an abuser of children, but as a kind of spiritual accountant, managing resources that others were too ignorant or cowardly to recognize as necessary. The papers included extensive correspondence with individuals whose identities remained partially concealed through the use of initials and coded references. However, enough detail remained to suggest that Crane was part of a network of like-minded individuals who shared his beliefs about the necessity of child sacrifice and who coordinated their activities across multiple institutions and locations. References to the Philadelphia operation, the Maryland facility, and our colleagues in Ohio suggested that St. Agatha's was one component of a much larger system designed to produce the raw material that Crane's theology required. Most disturbing were the detailed accounts of specific rituals that Crane had developed for what he termed the transformation of innocent suffering into protective power. These accounts, written with the clinical detachment of scientific observation, described systematic procedures for preparing children through periods of isolation, terror, and physical trauma, designed to maximize what Crane believed to be the spiritual energy released at the moment of death. Crane's descriptions of these procedures revealed a man who had convinced himself that the children's suffering served not only cosmic purposes, but also practical benefits for the surrounding community. He wrote extensively about his belief that the rituals conducted at St. Agatha's provided spiritual protection for Millbrook, preventing natural disasters, economic hardship, and social unrest that would otherwise have befallen the area. In Crane's understanding, the community's prosperity and stability were directly purchased through the suffering of the children within the orphanage walls. The arrangement requires constant renewal, Crane wrote in a 1940 entry. The protection purchased through previous offerings diminishes over time and must be replenished through fresh sacrifice. The community knows not what preserves them from the calamities that befall less protected areas, but their ignorance does not diminish their debt. We who understand the true economy bear the burden of maintaining the balance that their comfortable blindness depends upon. The documents from the 1940s and early 1950s revealed Crane's growing confidence in his theological system and his increasing elaborateness in ritual development. He wrote detailed instructions for procedures that he had developed to maximize what he termed the yield of spiritual energy from each child's death. These instructions included specifications for preparation periods, ritual implements, and ceremonial procedures that transformed murder into what Crane viewed as sacred act. Perhaps most chilling were Crane's records of his communications with what he described as the beneficiaries of our work, entities that he claimed provided guidance for the ritual procedures and confirmed the effectiveness of the offerings. These communications, according to Crane's accounts, took place during nighttime ceremonies conducted in the underground chambers and involved direct interaction with forces that existed beyond normal human perception. Crane's descriptions of these communications revealed a man who believed himself to be in direct contact with supernatural powers that confirmed the necessity and effectiveness of his work. He wrote extensively about receiving detailed instructions for ritual procedures, predictions about community events that could be prevented through proper sacrifice, and assurances that his work served cosmic purposes that transcended ordinary moral considerations. They have shown me the true structure of reality, Crane wrote in a 1948 entry. What appears to human eyes as separate individuals, children, families, communities, are merely components in a vast mechanism that requires constant maintenance through the application of carefully calibrated suffering. The children who pass through our care serve as fuel for this mechanism, their innocence converted into the energy that maintains stability for thousands of others who will never know the source of their protection. The documents from St. Agatha's final years revealed Crane's awareness that the institution's operations would eventually face scrutiny, but also his confidence that the work would continue in other forms and other locations. He wrote extensively about the training of successors who would carry on similar operations elsewhere, the establishment of new facilities that would serve the same purposes, and the development of improved methods for concealing institutional activities from official oversight. Crane's final entries, written during the weeks before St. Agatha's closure in 1958, took on an almost mystical quality as he reflected on 35 years of what he viewed as sacred service. He wrote about the hundreds of children who had died within the orphanage walls, not as victims, but as participants in a cosmic drama that transformed their suffering into spiritual currency of immeasurable value. The work is complete in this location, Crane wrote in his final entry, dated 3 days before the orphanage's official closure. The compact has been honored, the offerings have been accepted, and the protection has been secured for another generation. The children who served as vessels for this transaction have achieved a purpose higher than any earthly life could have provided. Their suffering has been transformed into salvation for thousands who will never know their names, but who benefit eternally from their sacrifice. The final document in Crane's collection was a detailed list of names and locations that appeared to represent the network of institutions that would continue the work he had begun at St. Agatha's. This list included facilities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, and New York, along with coded instructions for maintaining contact between operations and coordinating the supply of children needed for ongoing ritual requirements. The discovery of Crane's final testament provided definitive evidence that St. Agatha's had been operated not as a failed child welfare institution, but as a deliberate mechanism for the systematic murder of children under the guise of theological necessity. Crane's papers revealed a man who had developed an elaborate intellectual framework to justify acts of unspeakable cruelty, and who had convinced himself that mass murder served cosmic purposes that transcended ordinary moral consideration. More disturbing was the evidence that Crane's operation had been part of a larger network of similar institutions, suggesting that St. Agatha's represented not an isolated aberration, but one component of a systematic approach to child exploitation that operated across multiple states and decades. The network's apparent continuation beyond St. Agatha's closure raised the possibility that similar operations continued to function in locations where they had not yet been detected or exposed. The final testament provided answers to many of the questions that had surrounded St. Agatha's operations, but it also raised new and more troubling questions about the extent of institutional child abuse that might continue to operate under various forms of concealment. Crane's confidence in the continuation of his work suggested that the closure of St. Agatha's had represented not the end of systematic child sacrifice, but merely its relocation to new venues where it could continue to operate under improved methods of concealment. In the months following the discovery of Father Crane's final testament, investigators faced the complex challenge of determining how the revelations about St. Agatha's should be understood and what responsibilities they created for contemporary authorities and community members. The evidence was overwhelming that systematic murder had occurred within the orphanage walls, but the passage of time had rendered traditional forms of justice impossible. The perpetrators were dead, the immediate victims could not be saved, and the institutional structures that had enabled the crimes had long since been dismantled or transformed. Yet the impact of these revelations extended far beyond historical curiosity or academic interest. The community of Millbrook found itself forced to confront the reality that its prosperity and stability had potentially been built upon a foundation of unspeakable suffering, and that the collective silence that had enabled St. Agatha's operations represented a form of complicity that continued to shape community identity decades after the orphanage's closure. The psychological impact on Millbrook residents was immediate and profound. Many elderly community members who had lived through St. Agatha's operational period experienced intense guilt and anxiety as they reconsidered their memories of the institution and their own role in maintaining the silence that had protected its operations. Support groups were established to help residents process their feelings about having unknowingly benefited from what Crane had believed to be protective rituals funded by children suffering. Margaret Sullivan, who had grown up in Millbrook during the 1940s and had raised her own family in the community, spoke for many residents when she described the revelation's impact. "We always knew there was something strange about that place, but we told ourselves it wasn't our business. Now we find out that our comfort, our safety, everything we built here might have come at the cost of those children's lives. How do you live with that knowledge? How do you continue to call a place home when you know it was built on such horror?" The religious communities within Millbrook also struggled to understand their relationship to the revelations about St. Agatha's. The Catholic parish that had originally sponsored the orphanage faced particular challenges in addressing its historical connection to Crane's operations and its failure to provide adequate oversight of his activities. Parish leadership issued formal apologies and established memorial services for the children who had died at St. Agatha's. But many community members questioned whether such gestures were adequate responses to the magnitude of institutional failure that had been revealed. Protestant churches in the area also grappled with their own forms of complicity through decades of deliberate non-engagement with child welfare issues at St. Agatha's. Several congregations established special committees to examine their historical records and identify ways that they might have intervened to protect the orphanage's children. These examinations revealed uncomfortable patterns of institutional self-interest and community boundary maintenance that had prioritized religious and social divisions over basic human welfare concerns. The broader implications of St. Agatha's revelations extended well beyond Millbrook's community boundaries. Child welfare advocates and institutional oversight specialists recognized that the orphanage's operations had been enabled by systematic failures in regulatory structure that continued to create vulnerabilities in contemporary child protection systems. The ease with which St. Agatha's had maintained its institutional invisibility for 35 years highlighted ongoing weaknesses in oversight mechanisms that could potentially enable similar operations in the present day. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who directed the National Center for Institutional Child Protection, used St. Agatha's case as a framework for examining contemporary risks. What happened at St. Agatha's was possible because the institution operated in the gaps between different regulatory authorities, each of which assumed that someone else was providing adequate oversight. Those same gaps exist today, and they create opportunities for exploitation that we have not adequately addressed. Martinez's analysis identified several specific vulnerabilities in contemporary child protection systems that paralleled the conditions that had enabled St. Agatha's operations. Religious institutions continued to receive less intensive oversight than secular organizations, creating opportunities for abuse under the cover of spiritual authority. Private facilities that claimed to provide comprehensive internal services could still minimize external contact and oversight. Most significantly, children who existed on the margins of official documentation, particularly those from immigrant families or dysfunctional home situations, remained vulnerable to institutional exploitation that could operate below the threshold of official detection. The investigation of St. Agatha's also revealed troubling evidence about the network of similar institutions that Crane had referenced in his final testament. Follow-up investigations at several of the facilities mentioned in his papers revealed architectural anomalies, unexplained mortality patterns, and community silence that suggested comparable operations had indeed existed at multiple locations throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. The Blessed Heart Home for Children in rural Ohio, which had operated from 1935 to 1962, showed remarkably similar patterns to St. Agatha's: administrative invisibility, architectural concealment, and community complicity that had enabled decades of operation without effective oversight. Ground-penetrating radar at the Ohio facility revealed underground chambers and unmarked burial sites that suggested systematic murder had occurred there as well. Similar discoveries at facilities in Maryland, New York, and West Virginia indicated that Crane's network had been extensive and that St. Agatha's represented only one component of a systematic approach to institutional child exploitation that had operated across multiple states for several decades. The scope of these operations suggested that hundreds, possibly thousands of children had been systematically murdered under the guise of child welfare during the mid-20th century. The revelation of this network's extent created new challenges for law enforcement and child protection agencies. While the historical crimes were beyond prosecution, the operational methods that had enabled them remained relevant to contemporary institutional oversight. The network's success in maintaining concealment for decades provided a blueprint that could potentially be replicated by contemporary criminal organizations if adequate preventive measures were not implemented. Most troubling was the evidence that some components of Crane's network might have continued operation beyond the 1950s and 1960s closures of the facilities that had been identified. References in Crane's papers to evolutionary improvements in concealment methods and adaptation to contemporary oversight requirements suggested that the network had been designed to survive detection and continue operation in modified forms. Contemporary missing children cases in areas where network facilities had operated showed statistical anomalies that raised concerns about possible ongoing operations. While no definitive connections could be established, the patterns were consistent with systematic child acquisition and exploitation that utilized improved methods of concealment and documentation management. The weight of silence that had enabled St. Agatha's operations thus continued to reverberate through contemporary child protection systems. The same institutional dynamics that had allowed systematic murder to occur under the guise of child welfare. Compartmentalized oversight, deference to institutional authority, and community preference for comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable investigation remained active in contemporary society. The children of St. Agatha's had been failed not only by the individuals who had directly participated in their exploitation, but by entire systems of social organization that prioritized institutional convenience over individual welfare. Their suffering had been enabled by the collective decision of multiple communities to refrain from asking difficult questions about institutional operations that claimed religious or charitable purposes. Understanding this broader context of complicity became essential for developing effective responses to the revelations about St. Agatha's and similar institutions. The horror of what had occurred could not be addressed simply through individual guilt or institutional apology, but required systematic examination of the social and administrative structures that had made such operations possible. The silence that had protected St. Agatha's for 65 years was finally broken, but the weight of that silence continued to shape the communities and institutions that had enabled its maintenance. Breaking the silence was only the beginning of a much larger process of reckoning with the systematic failures that had allowed unspeakable suffering to occur under the guise of respectable institutional care. As winter settled over the abandoned grounds of St. Agatha's Home for Children, the investigation that had consumed more than a year of intensive research reached a conclusion that was both definitive and deeply unsatisfying. The evidence was overwhelming that systematic murder had occurred within the orphanage walls, that this murder had been conducted according to elaborate theological justifications, and that it had been enabled by networks of complicity that extended throughout the surrounding community and administrative structures. Yet for all the documentation that had been uncovered, for all the architectural secrets that had been revealed, and for all the institutional failures that had been exposed, fundamental questions remained unanswered. The fate of individual children could not be determined with certainty. The full extent of the network that had enabled St. Agatha's operations remained unclear. Most troubling, the possibility that similar operations continued to function in other locations under improved methods of concealment could not be definitively eliminated. The physical remains of St. Agatha's now carried the weight of confirmed knowledge about the suffering that had occurred within its walls. The stone buildings that had once concealed systematic murder now served as silent monuments to children whose names were known only from Father Crane's ledgers, and whose individual stories would never be fully recovered. The grounds that had once hidden unmarked graves now provided the only physical connection to lives that had been deliberately erased from official memory. Visitors to the site, whether investigators, journalists, or community members seeking to understand their local history, consistently reported a sense of presence that seemed to emanate from the buildings and grounds themselves. This presence was not the dramatic supernatural manifestation of popular imagination, but rather a profound sense of witness, as if the stones themselves had absorbed the memory of what had occurred and continued to hold that memory in trust for a world that had failed to protect the children who had suffered and died there. The renovation work that had initially led to the discovery of Crane's hidden records was suspended indefinitely as the site was redesigned as a memorial to the children who had died at St. Agatha's. The memorial's design reflected the complex relationship between remembrance and incompleteness that characterized all aspects of the investigation. Individual markers honored children whose names were known from orphanage records, but additional markers acknowledged the likelihood that other children had died whose names and stories had been lost entirely. The memorial's central feature was a simple stone inscription that read, "In memory of the children who lived and died at St. Agatha's Home for Children, 1923 to 1958. Their suffering was real. Their lives had value. They are not forgotten." Below this inscription, a second line added, "May their memory guide us toward vigilance in protecting those who cannot protect themselves." This language of vigilance reflected the memorial's intended function, not merely as a site of remembrance, but as a continuing call to responsibility. The investigation of St. Agatha's had revealed that institutional evil flourishes not through the actions of individual monsters, but through the accumulated failures of ordinary people and organizations to ask difficult questions, to challenge institutional authority, and to prioritize individual welfare over administrative convenience. The lessons learned from St. Agatha's investigation were incorporated into training programs for child welfare workers, institutional oversight specialists, and community organizations involved in child protection. These programs emphasize the importance of maintaining external oversight of all institutions serving children, regardless of their religious affiliation or charitable mission. They stress the need for direct, unmediated contact with children in institutional care, and the responsibility of community members to report concerns rather than deferring to institutional authority. More broadly, the St. Agatha's case became a framework for understanding how systematic abuse can operate within apparently legitimate institutional structures. Academic researchers in sociology, criminology, and child welfare used the case to develop improved methods for detecting institutional concealment and for creating oversight systems that could not be easily circumvented by determined perpetrators. The investigation also contributed to ongoing efforts to locate and investigate other facilities that might have been part of the network that Crane had referenced in his papers. While definitive proof of ongoing operations remained elusive, several institutions were placed under enhanced oversight based on historical connections to known network facilities or contemporary patterns that suggested potential concealment of irregular activities. Perhaps most importantly, the St. Agatha's investigation reinforced the understanding that protecting vulnerable children requires not only professional vigilance, but active community engagement. The systematic failure that had enabled 35 years of murder under the guise of child welfare had been possible only because entire communities had chosen not to see, not to question, and not to act on concerns that might have disrupted comfortable assumptions about institutional legitimacy. As the first anniversary of the ledger's discovery approached, community members in Millbrook and surrounding areas organized annual remembrance events that combined memorial services for the children who had died at St. Agatha's with educational programs about contemporary child protection. These events emphasized the ongoing nature of the responsibility that the investigation had revealed, the need for constant vigilance, continued questioning of institutional authority, and sustained commitment to protecting children who might otherwise exist in the margins of community awareness. The children of St. Agatha's had been failed by systems of care that were supposed to protect them, but their memory now served as a foundation for improved protection of children who faced similar vulnerabilities in contemporary society. Their suffering had been transformed not into the spiritual currency that Father Crane had imagined, but into knowledge and commitment that might prevent similar suffering in the future. The investigation would continue in the sense that ongoing efforts to locate other network facilities and to strengthen contemporary child protection systems carried forward the work that had begun with the discovery of discrepancies in orphanage records. The questions that had been raised about institutional oversight, community responsibility, and the protection of vulnerable children remained active concerns that required sustained attention and commitment. Standing in the abandoned chapel where Father Crane had once conducted his twisted rituals, where children had suffered and died according to theological justifications that served only to mask systematic murder, visitors to St. Agatha's encountered silence that was different from the silence that had protected institutional secrets for 65 years. This was not the silence of concealment, but the silence of witness, a quiet that held space for memory, for grief, and for the ongoing commitment to ensure that such suffering would not be allowed to occur again. The eternal vigil that now surrounded St. Agatha's was maintained not by supernatural forces, but by human commitment to remember, to question, and to protect. The children who had died within those stone walls had finally found voices through the investigators who had uncovered their stories and the communities that had committed to honoring their memory through improved protection of vulnerable children. Their silence had been broken, but the vigilance that their memory demanded would need to continue as long as children required protection from those who would exploit their vulnerability. The weight of that responsibility was now shared by all who had learned their stories and understood the systematic failures that had enabled their suffering. In the end, the children of St. Agatha's had achieved a form of immortality, not through the twisted theology that had justified their murder, but through the commitment of later generations to ensure that their suffering would serve as a foundation for protection rather than exploitation. Their memory had become a source of strength for the ongoing work of vigilance that their deaths had made necessary. The investigation was complete, but the vigil would continue,